Do you remember when you were a kid and like January time, you'd all come back to school after Christmas and everyone was talking about their Christmas presents and there was a lot of similarity, a lot of crossover. And I remember when I was a kid, one year, a lot of us, maybe it fell off the back of a lorry, but loads of the kids at school got chemistry sets. And some of us were following carefully the diagrams that were all laid out there in front of you, mixing your sulphurs and your citric acids and making your little experiments. And some kids took every sodding thing in the box, mixed it together and lost their eyebrows. Sometimes I think Minisforum might be that child with no eyebrows because, heavens to God, sometimes they roll out with products like this one that are either batshit crazy or are simply made for the sake of being made. This is the Minisforum MS R1. We talked about this in about spring summertime 2025 over at Computex when they were first showing the prototype. This is an ARM workstation. Now, we're familiar at this point with Minisforum's workstation machines, utilising that fantastic entrance-exit point for the motherboard, and we're used to the, they arrive with 10 GBE, they arrive with PCIe upgradability, they arrive with decent enough CPUs and memory capabilities, and this is no different. But it's built on ARM. This is trying to be an alternative, I would say, although they never say in their marketing materials, to one of the Mac M series of devices from Apple there. Arriving with a Chinese-made ARM processor inside, which is a 12-core ARM processor, the CD8180. It also arrives with 64 gig of ECC memory, LPDDR5 for measure as well, which is already kind of batshit crazy again, bonkers enough. But it arrives with two 10 gig copper outlets and even a PCIe, which is a physical times 16 but is actually a 4 times 8. You heard me, Gen 4. It also has two Gen 4 M.2 NVMe slots inside, one at times 4 times 4 and the other one at times 4 Gen 4 times 2, and all of this again built on ARM. Arriving at between $500 and $600, because they always do that day one launch pricing. It arrives with that 64 gig of ECC pre-soldered to the board there, although you do have to get your own OS SSD. You can get it with an SSD included. The unit they've sent me, and again, they've supplied the unit. They're not paying for this. They're seeing at the same time as you, etc. This device arrived with a 1 TB SSD inside it. It was a Kingston SN, I think an SNV SSD. I'll have to double check there on the notes. But straight out the gate, who the hell is this for? And although normally when I talk about Minisforum mini PCs, I would then talk about utilising this as a NAS, I'm not sure I'm ever going to use this as a NAS. I know I could probably use it for VMs, and again, even on an ARM, and we'll come back to that later on. I'm going to say right now, as things with AI utilisation, as we are erring more and more towards efficient hardware in our work and personal lives, and particularly because a lot of mobile devices that are already built substantially on ARM development are out there, there is logic, there is rhyme and reason in this CPU being chosen. It is an ARM v9, so it's very cutting edge in terms of ARM processor, but it's nowhere near as efficient as some of the ARM processors we've talked about, which is kind of the contradiction in terms. I know Mac, and obviously with their billions of squillions of quid, have got all the money for the development there, so it's very hard to make a comparison in terms of, overall output of their processors, but we have to at least acknowledge that this system is designed predominantly, I would argue, for ARM development, which is a key point there, because this rolls out, by the way, with their own playbook, their own knowledge base. It's pretty extensive. This isn't the first Minisforum device I featured on the channel, but it is the first that I've seen them roll out with such a substantial knowledge base on day one. Notwithstanding, it arrived with Bookworm Debian 12 already on that SSD when you get it with the drive included. But on top of that, following a lot of those guides, they've already got the installation of running something like Android 14 on there. You can go ahead and use the ARM splinter of Proxmox there on board to run multiple VMs, something I've done later on in the video, running it as a multimedia server. There's even talk on there of utilising it within AI, because that CPU has a promised or at least promoted capability of up to 45 tera operations per second. Now that isn't going to be comparable to a high-end GPU equipped unit, although obviously you could put a low profile GPU in the PCIe slot if you chose to. Circling back to the SSD storage inside, I will highlight that the Gen 4 x 4 speed slot goes up to a full 2210 length SSD. That's going to be those longer ones with a higher capacity or power loss protection built in. But the second M.2 slot is actually an M.2 E key. So again, that one that you're going to have to swap out either for an adapter to take care of larger storage or compact, smaller factor network drives inside. Now, I did transfer data between the two of them, and unsurprisingly, because of the 4x2 lane speed, it actually capped down. I saw performance transferring between them at 3.5 to 3.6 gigabytes per second within the Bookworm OS that it arrived with. Now, how that performance is realised externally, well, I was able to fully saturate 10 GBE with that very, very easily using 4 simultaneous streams. Now, when I tried to access both of them at the same time, I did struggle to fully saturate both 10G connections on the M.2 inside. That was with using the Debian OS that it included inside, so presumably if I used something a little lighter, something a bit more file efficient perhaps, or if I'd started knocking around with other Debian OSs, or maybe even stuck with the Android one to keep things clean, or even the Proxmox stuff there, or the ARM PVE, maybe I could have fully saturated them there. There's definitely enough bandwidth to the network controllers inside. But ultimately, across both simultaneously being accessed, it was around 15 to 16 gigabits per second rather than the full 20. Now, factoring that in, when you go into the controller, they're taking advantage of the RTL8127. There's two 10G controllers, one per port, and the two controllers inside are both on a Gen 4 x 1 lane each. So it was, 20 gigabits, give or take, for both controllers. So there was no real limitation there for them both to stretch out their muscles. So really, it was a case of the OS, I am sure, and I've got full confidence that you could saturate both of those connections on this base hardware in the right architecture and software environment. In terms of thermals, again, I was pretty impressed with what I saw here. We saw when you had the system up and running for about 24 hours, because it's an ARM architecture rather than more aggressive x86, it wasn't getting too toasty. It left the fan automatic, and we'll talk about noise in a moment. I saw around 32 degrees to 33 on the front, 35 on the top, and that was going all the way inside. On the rear, I saw 34 to 35 degrees with the CPU, when I got down to the CPU fan at the vent at the back, sitting at around 45 to 48 there. And just the general base of the system, slightly raised by a few millimeters, it was only around 33 degrees. So temperatures were pretty darn good. Definitely lower than any other Minisforum workstation I've looked at, and let's face it, that architecture is a big part of that. And when it came to noise, I tested two different noise environments. I went with the fan set to automatic, and then ramping them to the max. When the fans were set to automatic, the decibel level was only around 33 to 35. Again, it was one of the quietest Minisforum workstations I've looked at there, and clearly it's because the architecture inside wasn't going Johnny Big Bananas. When I set the fan to maximum from a distance of 1 foot with my DJI mic, it went to about 45 to 46 dBA there. So again, respectable numbers overall, and just generally, this is not a workstation that you're going to, be losing any sleep over. But it was power consumption that really, really interested me. That CPU is a rated 28 watt TDP. How did that translate on this system during different operational environments? I'll say right now, when I had the system at complete standby, complete, ready to go, screen off, just waiting to be woken up, it went as low as 1.2, maybe as high as 2 watt at most, when I had the system just sitting there idly waiting to be played with. Now, when I had the CPU at 25% utilization and the RAM utilization, I would say a good 10 to 15% use, it went up to 22 to 23 watts. So that was with the system doing some bells and whistles and guns in the background, but nothing too nuts. When I went to 100% utilization with fans at full utilization with both 10 gig NICs at utilization, we saw power consumption of around 43 to 44 watts. So again, not low numbers, and certainly not lower than most ARM systems we've seen in the market that will sit around 10 to 20 watts, but that's because this CPU is trying to break the mold and challenge both x86 and also give you more in ARM. And that's why, when you compare this again against some of the other x86 alternatives from Minisforum, which will often break the 3-digit mark in terms of watt draw, I was really happy with those power numbers, and the fact it arrives with an external 100-watt power brick almost seems extraneous and unnecessary, but still happy with the power consumption, happy with the noise, happy with the thermals. Now, say you're looking at this as less of a plaything and more of a just a day-to-day utilising Windows desktop. I would say right now, although there is ARM versions of Windows out there, the big barrier you're going to find with this device is driver support, because right now, notwithstanding this is a very, very new CPU compared with others in the market, ARM drivers aren't as common as their x86 brethren, and running Windows in this, you may hit walls. I know we're getting to a point now where gaming in ARM is a great deal more accessible, but it's still hardly mainstream by comparison. And if you want to utilize this as a media server, for example, because as mentioned in that large database playbook of theirs that they've supplied alongside this, there is a full guide there to make containerized versions and running containerized versions of things like Jellyfin. And when I did run Jellyfin on this, when it came to native playback, I'll tell you right now, it ran like an absolute chuffing dream. When I was running 3 high-end 4K test files there with no transcoding on board, this thing barely cracked 10 to 15%. And when I ran 3 high-end 8K native media files from this, the CPU only reached around 20 to 25% utilization there. However, despite the fact that it does support H.265 or HEVC decode and encode, running in Jellyfin and getting Jellyfin to identify the Mali graphics drivers and do hardware transcoding of any measure just was messy. It didn't really play nice. And this is what I mean about coming back to that driver stuff and ultimately trying to figure out who the heck this is for. Now, if you compare this against the rest of the Minisforum workstation series with 210GBEs, PCIe M.2 and 64GB of memory, this thing is notably cheaper than all of them. That said, it is still more expensive than other devices in the market that are running on Intel Twin Lake, that are running on some of those AMD quad-core chips that are starting to arrive, like the 8845HS, that arrive with things like ECC support. And pricing-wise for this, they're obviously going to need to price up the development on this at the Minisforum backend, but I do think there is an argument for trying to work out who is spending 500 to 600 Nika on a system that, at least in architecturally across the market in development, feels unfinished. This is for users that want to play around but also develop within ARM. I think that's who this is for. It is not for users who want to take advantage of the existing ARM landscape. This is for people that want to develop within ARM, that like the platform that Mac has built with the M series, but don't want to be locked in on Mac OS and want to be able to use lots of different operating systems, as well as have the scalability afforded to this in terms of connectivity and upgradability. That's who I think this is for. Users that want to work within ARM and develop and improve ARM. And for that, I'm not going to say Minisforum and Noble in that regard, but at the very least, I do think there is an audience in that field. For the rest of you, I can't say this is better than an MS-01. I can't say this is better than an A2. This has a unique architecture, but I don't think the man on the street will ever appreciate it. This mini PC is Cocoa for Cocoa Pops, and frankly pisses all over Raspberry Pi development right now in terms of its scale. But it's always going to live in the shadow of x86 processors in the market at just a few $100s more. We talk about NAS on the channel all the time, and the number of affordable 10G NAS systems that roll out in the last few years that featured an ARM CPU, which on paper is good and in terms of efficiency is good. In terms of NAS development, ARM is still not great in terms of consistent file processing at scale. This has brought the margins closer, and it's going to be really interesting to see where this goes and this architecture goes, and whether people at B-Link, people at GMK Tech, people at other mini PC brands are going to look at this and go, there's some money there. But it's good that Minisforum have taken the first step. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments if this is going to float your boat, or even if you are someone that's thinking of buying this and your use case isn't one I covered. I really want to hear from you. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching. Now, there should be a link below to the written review of this device, hopefully live at the same time as this video. But at the same time, if you are interested in getting hold of this and you want to support what we do, I'm not going to ask you to do the Ko-Fi, the Patreon and the YouTube members. It's extra money. We're all brass at these days, but if you're going to get hold of this, please use the links in the description to do so, because we get a small commission on anything you buy there. By we, I mean me and Eddie here at NAS Compares, and it allows us to keep doing what we do. It's a passive way for you not to support us, but other creators, and do it without costing you a single penny more than you were going to spend. But only do it if you find these videos helpful, mine and everyone else's. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.